So Sosela is an advisory firm focusing specifically on the entertainment industry. We look at the entire value chain from the creators to those who then help publish and make the creators' works accessible, to those who want to license, etc., the entire value chain. And our motivation really is to give sound legal and strategic advice, to help people understand what their rights are, to help those who want to use those rights, to license them fairly and effectively, and just to help businesses, and when I say businesses, not only corporations, but also individuals, maximize their worth within the industry. So, and it's music, TV, film, everything really.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. I would add to that, I guess, from my perspective. So we both, I guess, have different core specialities, and I focus primarily on deal making, contract drafting, contract negotiation. Also throughout the chain. So whether it be the licensing of copyrights or publishing transactions or record label deals or film production, or within the context of a film production, all the contracts that are required in the area.
I think the challenge that we have in South Africa is that our industry is not well structured. So you kind of have everyone doing everything that needs to be done, but like you mentioned girls, you mentioned, in the States, you've got unions. It's a well-unionized territory where musicians can belong to an organization that will represent them, protect them, fight for their rights, etc. Whereas here we don't have that kind of organizational capacity, which makes it very difficult. The law is there. You've got the legislation. You've got practices that have been entrenched over decades. Whether those practices are correct is another question. But I think in terms of formalization, there's definitely a big gap there, which is problematic.
I think, especially in the context of maybe independent musicians or independent artists, I think it's even trickier. And I think the lack of organization or structure with regards to entertainment law, it's structure as a whole, I guess. So there's not a lot of platforms. If you go to other countries, it's not just the huge commercial pop artists that can make a living off art or music. You have ecosystems, where you have small independent record labels, you have managers, there's a thriving independent nightlife circuit and there's the magazines that write about it. There's a much bigger ecosystem that doesn't exist here for independent artists, and I think the same can be said for entertainment law. I think a lot of musicians and artists, when they're presented with the contract, a lot of people do seek legal advice on that before they sign.
But we do have entities, and this is why, for example, the collective management organizations play such a big role, because they're the few structures that exist, so you've got your SAMROs, your RISAs, CAPASO, etc. And I think they then become by default the sort of central elements around which, this is now in the music space, that a lot of the industry revolves. That's why they're so important, and that's good, that's great. But you still need other entities, to support and bolster, because it's not only about those copyright royalties. The industry is a lot wider than that. Andrew's mentioning, for example, management and those kind of, music managers. In a space where you've got really well-organized forums where those managers can meet, benchmark, create industry norms, and also have almost like what becomes a barrier to entry. So if you are going to be a manager, you need to be a manager, because right now in South Africa, a lot of managers are just, I've been with you since your first open mic session back in the day, so I'll manage you, which is great because you've got the loyalty, but the knowledge and the know-how. To be a manager, it's actually a very technical job. You need to understand a lot about everything, and which I think is lacking here. And it's because we don't have that infrastructure that supports those professionals to ensure that they have a minimum standard, I think, of performance, And
venues.
Yeah. And now with this COVID situation, venues are, even, those that we were relying on are closing.
Artists' response to IP, I don't think necessarily changed because of streaming. I think the power dynamics that are at play within the industry have been consistent from tapes to CDs to vinyl, CD, digital. I mean, the record labels or whoever may be the manager or something, people can still get hoodwinked, I guess. And especially in in an independent jazz world like in South Africa, where there are a few jazz musicians in South Africa who are managing to maybe make a decent living through gigging and CD sales. A lot of jazz musicians don't necessarily have the infrastructure around them to be gigging every weekend. And if someone like a record label comes along and offers a deal, the PR that would come with that, hopefully, and the marketing is something that a lot of people will jump at, And I think because of that, and because they're in a tough situation because there's no ecosystem around them that they can rely on, I think people are still signing bad contracts. How that relates to streaming, that's what I guess what I'm saying is the streaming doesn't really change that, I think. What streaming does do is it makes it even harder to make money off, not small, but niche or alternative or independent art forms. To get good money, you would have made a lot more money selling 1,000 CDs 10 years ago than you will do from getting 50,000 or 100,000 streams now. And I think, and the CD market has, at least in jazz in South Africa, there is still like a stalwart of like CD collectors, but I've seen in the last few years is also dying down now. So I think streaming makes it difficult. If you're going to rely on that for money, you need to have gigs. And in terms of ownership of masters, I think that's something that if you're not going to own your masters, you at least have to try and negotiate. So if the record label's paying for the recording and they're not willing to budge on ownership, you need to make sure you get a high percentage of royalties, especially because now streaming is the main thing.
So I think maybe your question is, do people now know more than they did before? The answer is kind of yes and no. So now there are a lot of buzzwords, like you mentioned masters, like own your masters. Like now it's like, okay guys, because we've had this terrible history, now you must just own your masters. But there's a lot of understanding and knowledge that needs to come in even with that. Even if you don't own your masters, have you negotiated a deal that's good enough to sustain you into the future? Because that's where the real industry knowledge is important, is that, okay, so I've got this asset, I'm creating, I'm gonna sign, if I am signing with someone, or even if I record it myself, I then own it. But what am I going to do with this asset? Like, you can have a sewing machine in your house. It's an asset that could generate money, but if it's just sitting in your study and not doing anything, you're not sewing anything, it's worth nothing. So these masters, even if you don't own them, there's understanding licensing strategies. If you do create it yourself, how do I license it out so I can still fully monetize that asset? And I think that's where the real knowledge is now, like understanding how to strategically sweat your asset if you own it, or if you are going to sign with someone else, they'll own the asset, but have you been able to negotiate a deal that still gives you enough return on investment, you know what I mean? So even if you don't own the asset, the attitude to IP, I think there is now more of a sense of, guys, we can't keep getting screwed over, But what does that mean? For you to then actually truly not be screwed over and truly make this a proper worthwhile thing, you still need to understand the different types of deals you can get in with, whether it's a distributor, whether it's a label. So it's not just about, we must own our masters, like, okay, and then what? And then what? So it's really understanding. For me, it's this industry, I don't know, the more I'm in it, and it's all about licensing. You know what I mean? Whether you own the asset or not, like, can you get into a good licensing deal? Whether you're licensing the distribution, whether you're licensing.
You had mentioned that jazz music or independent music was kind of a focus for you. And I think it's a tricky thing for jazz musicians in this country, in that there aren't a lot of record labels that are interested in really pushing jazz in this country. It's not the focus, it's not where the revenue is for the record labels, apparently. There are exceptions to the rule. So I think a lot of jazz musicians are releasing independently. And I think this issue of streaming then becomes about negotiating with a digital distributor or aggregator about how your music will be streamed. And there you should own the masters and you'll be licensing it to them. But unless you have a serious push from a PR campaign or Apple Music or some of the fortunately Apple Music is at the moment starting to focus on jazz quite a lot and trying to push it, which is great in South Africa. But without some sort of PR campaign or something behind you. Your streaming, you need to get on the playlists in order to get the numbers up. And then, unless you get on those playlists, you're not going to earn a lot of money from streaming. The numbers are low. And
the numbers are low. You need millions and millions and millions of streams.
Yeah.
I mean, you need over 20 million streams, I think, to make $1 million. You know.
More than that, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's hard to get 1 million streams.
Yeah.
You know, particularly if it's not like pop or piano, you know, stuff that's like pumping. Like everything else, it's a struggle. If you make it to 5 million streams, you've done well, actually.
You've done very well, yeah.
But financially, it's probably not that much.
So I think we took a sad decision when we started that we had to focus outside South Africa for all the reasons I guess I've just mentioned. We decided to sort of focus on scenes or cities outside of South Africa that have very vibrant and ecosystems around the sort of music we create, which is jazz oriented, but sort of left and right and sort of quite eclectic. But yeah, we decided that we were going to focus on certain areas, and we had to employ PR companies in those regions. We had to try and make connections with people in those regions who were sort of the gatekeepers or whatever, which is not always easy, and just keep hitting on the door, you know. And it's a slow process, because I think also when you start now, and we saw vinyl as being a big part of our strategy, not only because we love vinyl, but also it's a great marketing tool. It means the music spreads in a very different way. But when you start incorporating vinyl and PR campaigns in the USA and Britain and France, the cost of an album release becomes very expensive. So it also then becomes tricky, because you have to try and recoup those costs. And it just means you get a lot of great press, and still it's not like we're selling millions or streaming millions or selling millions of copies. So it's a long-term, we've taken a very long-term game plan on what Mashomao is going to become and what it looks like, which but hopefully there'll come a time when we get as much love here as we do overseas, I guess. That's kind of the goal.
Where you have genres like definitely what you guys are doing, even in South Africa, right? Where you're not going to get radio play. And even your sort of traditional media, PR, marketing is great, but I mean, I'm finding that, you know, it's really about connecting and building your own community and then steering them to the streaming. We can't rely on the tradition, even though right now, especially in South Africa, the original gatekeepers are still the gatekeepers. So you can, basically, if your song's not a hit on radio, then it's not a hit. If your song's they're not talking about it in the Sunday papers, then it's not a hit. But actually,
the streets talk depending on the music, but
depending on the music.
Yeah.
But I mean, I find, which is not jazz, but I think it's an amazing example. A. Reese, the hip hop artist, all he has to do, because his community is so engaged.
Yeah.
So he doesn't even need to be on radio. He doesn't even need to he just tweets something or just drops something on, and everyone he trends on the internet, and everyone goes and downloads or streams that track. And I think that is the future, particularly for niche genres that won't find space in the traditional media. But actually everyone is eventually going there, because I think that's the beauty of the internet. It's a slow process, but at the end of the day, the gatekeepers will no longer always be the gatekeepers. So for me, this is not a legal thing, but that community engagement, for me, that's where it is. Maskandi artists do it all the time. They say, Sunday, guys, I'm not performing, but let's meet at JP Park. 3,000 people come and they just chat about whatever. Captive audience. You know, all you then need to do is then, if you just drop something, you don't need to then, hey, plugging, yeah, PR campaign. Yes, that's always great, you still do it. But that one-on-one interaction I'm seeing in the industry is actually the real way, the only way to really, and it's like kind of like going back to basics almost. And it's not easy, but I think that's how many of us and many genres are going to survive.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like within that context, also organizing, I guess. So I think like one of my passions is building the platforms that I've been lucky enough to go overseas once or twice and see, like via touring with some of the artists we work with, and to see the ecosystems that I spoke of earlier. And one of my passions is trying to build those platforms and systems because no one else will, for independent alternative artists in this country. And we all, like as a community, we're starting to, we're all in, at least our age group, we're in our late 30s now. Maybe we should have done more already, but I want to make sure that the generations that come after us, like in 10 years' time, this landscape of independent jazz, left field stuff in South Africa there needs to be platforms built by us now that people can rely on in the future, you know. And that's something that I see Sosela as being part of as well.
Yeah. In terms of that infrastructure, I mean, on the legal side, just getting good legal advice is very hard, you know, in our industry. And not to say that we are now the saviors that have come, definitely not. There are good people out there who do give that good advice, but people can't access them, they can't afford it. So I think that's part of our challenge. How do we then plug in and add value to that aspect of the industry?
It's a long-term.
Just making sure that we have good contracts floating around. So, you know that people reuse contracts. So at least if you really hammer and workshop one contract for a client, you know that they're going to reuse that contract. And so you know that there's at least a good benchmark. That little contribution.
Yeah, because a lot of the contracts floating around over the last 20 years in South Africa have been very one-sided, I guess. Yeah.
And people just reuse the same contract. Like, people don't even engage. You know, you'll have organizations this is the contract we've always used since 1993. So now here you look at this contract, you're like, house, right? You know? So it's that, creating new precedents, playing a role in creating new precedents in the industry. Is something that I think we want to do.
Definitely. It's a hard one because we obviously we're a new business. We don't have a lot of manpower at this point. I mean, there are 3 of us at the moment, and we need to keep the lights on. So it's a constant toss-up between trying to find clients that can pay reasonable fees that keep us going, and at the same time also trying to be there for people who can't pay those fees. It's a long-term strategy of ours, I think, to try and, as we grow and as we are able to employ more people or bring more people in as partners or consultants or associates, and our capacity grows, we hope then to be able to more and more each year do both.
And I think the way we're doing it now already is giving, I mean, the clients, particularly individual artists, you know, people trying to get into their first deal, giving them really reduced rates. I mean, literally, it's almost pro bono, you know, and just having the time for anyone, you know, time is hard to find, right? But being able to just chat to people, young kids who are like, okay, this is what I'm trying to do, and help them. But I'm going to now take this opportunity to say that as a long-term goal, not even long, mid-term goal, I would love to, and obviously as Sosela, to have a law clinic. So a law clinic is, and this is something it's been my dream for the last couple of years, is, for example, you can go to Wits Law Clinic now if you've got a labor issue, if you've got a family law issue, I think basic contract, and you go there and they'll so the final year students, supervised by the professors and actual attorneys, will then assist you. So if you've got like a divorce issue, maintenance issue, you go there, the students help you out, obviously goes through their supervisor, and they'll, hey, let's get to court, free legal services for people. And sometimes I'm naming those particular departments because I know that's the service they give, but no one does that for entertainment law. So anyone who's watching this, who'd like to sponsor us, to partner with us, to open a law clinic, either through an institution or whatever, that is, for me, that's the thing, Sosela will be what we carry on doing, working at a sort of a high level strategic corporate space, but something like a law clinic for artists is so crucial. I mean, I've pitched to some universities, like, yeah, it's a great idea. That's what we would love to do, and we need partners for that, because then we just work with the final year law students, we supervise them, people come through, we look at their contracts, or help them get sort of
You can build templates
for them, so your basic things. So it won't be like an in-depth one-on-one negotiation for this 2 million rand deal. That's now different, but like just people need the most basic stuff that we find to be the most basic. Just understanding what am I giving away? What am I getting back? This percentage is wrong. Negotiate something. So a forum like that is something that, that'll just light my fire. So still I'm a sponsor.